Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's open together with a word of prayer. Holy Spirit, we just invite you to come. Lord, as we just talk about your word, Lord, and what does hospitality to the least of these look like, Lord, and what your heart is for the people who are hurting and who are in need, Lord, the people that maybe society doesn't acknowledge. Lord, I pray that you would just lead us into your heart today. Lord, I pray that we would just find ourselves wanting what you want and desiring what you desire and seeing what you see. Holy Spirit, would you just open our eyes to all that you have for us today? I pray that you would meet us here, that we would encounter you in the midst of your word and your people, Lord, and that this time would just be an offering to you that you're worthy of. Lord, because you're worthy of everything that we have to give you. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So, thank you guys for having me today. I really appreciate getting to be here. I also think it's cool that, because we get to set up the tables for you guys on Saturdays, and I was really excited when they asked if we would set up an extra table, because that means that there's more people who are coming into your family and getting to participate in all of the rich goodness that's going on here in the Delco community, and so that's really fun. And I love this series that you guys are going through right now. I think it's a really cool idea, and I think it's really cool that we as the body of Christ know that there are ways that every single person in this room is uniquely serving God and relating to God, and that we get to have the opportunity to learn from one another and engage in that with each other. And I'm honored just to have a few minutes today to share about what that looks like in my life. And what that looks like with hospitality to the least of these. And so I think it's thriving in hospitality to the least of these. When Jordan asked me to share on that topic, hospitality to the least of these, I've always wrestled with that phrase because I know it's a scriptural phrase. Like Jesus says, whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And we'll talk about that verse a little bit today. And for a while, I was like, Jesus, why are you calling people least of these? Like, that's kind of weird. And I don't know if you guys ever thought that too, but like that was something that, especially like just getting into the line of work that I'm in, like for a while I was kind of going back and forth, like, why, Lord, why would you do that? But the more that I kind of spent time with it, there's two things that I realized. One is, and I just want to preface it with this so that as we continue to use this language, you guys know what I mean. The first thing is, a few chapters before, Jesus says, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And so what he's doing really is he's inverting the paradigm. And so even when he's calling people the least of these, you know, his heart is for these people. And if he says the last shall be first and the first shall be last, then there's a special thing that he has for people in the situation that he's referring to. The second thing that is important to note is that he's mostly making a cultural reference. So he's saying, like, this is what society perceives as the least of these. This is what the people, I'm specifically speaking to what the people around me, people that I'm speaking to right now, would consider less than. And this is what I expect of you. This is how I expect you to treat these people. And so that's just the context that I want to kind of place the rest of the conversation today in. But I guess I want to start with just like, why does this matter to me? Why is this topic important to me, and why are the people that we'll be talking about today important to me? And the answer that I came up with really, and that the answer that the Lord's been working on in my heart for the past 5 years is just simple. It's because these people matter to God. The people who are struggling, the people who are broken, the people who are marginalized, the people who are overlooked, the people who society deems as outcasts or decides to engage less with. Like, these are all people that deeply matter to God. And so if they matter to God, then they matter to me, right? And so before we get into just a little bit about what hospitality to the least of these looks like, I want to share my story with just how I got involved in the Dream Center and serving people in the community who have need. And it's kind of an interesting story because a lot of it has to do with like just the way the Lord has really graciously worked on my heart over the last I don't know, gosh, at this point, like 15 years. But when I was in middle school, I was a very anxious person. So I mean, like, I was severely anxious. I was seeing a counselor. I was on medication. I was having panic attacks. Like, I was a severe germaphobe. Like, I would rewash spoons. So, like, you take them out of the dishwasher, they'd be clean by hand in the sink, and then they'd be clean in the dishwasher. And then before I used them, I would clean them in the sink again because I was just like, I'm not risking it. I was like a very big germaphobe. I was afraid of people. I had severe social anxiety, and I remember, like, Kirsten and I actually were talking about this the other day because she had a similar experience in middle school. Like, and maybe this is a common middle school experience, but like I would have panic attacks. Like, going into the lunchroom, I'd get just super anxious, and I would walk in and I would just not know like how to interact with people, how to engage with people, where to sit, and that was my experience, like, with just people across the board. I had a lot of anxiety when it came to thunderstorms. It would, like, and when I was like, this is a little embarrassing. When I was like 13, 14, like, if there was a thunderstorm, I'd be like in the fetal position in my basement, like afraid that I was gonna die. Like, I had a lot of angst going on internally. And that was a really defining thing for who I was. Like, I had defined myself as an anxious person. And I grew up at this point in my life in a pretty well-to-do family. Like, we had a pretty nice house. We had like 5 bathrooms in our house and like tons of bedrooms, and like it was like we had everything that we needed. Like, and I wasn't wanting for anything, but I was just pretty uncomfortable, pretty miserable on a day-to-day basis. And about that time, when I was 15, I had the opportunity to go with my family on a missions trip to El Salvador. And so we go to El Salvador, and some of the biggest things that were like building up angst in me was like, El Salvador has severe tropical storms, specifically in the seasons that we would go. And it just isn't like the cleanest place in the world. Like, the stuff that, like, the utensils we'd be using, like, I wasn't sure if they had been washed 3 times, and like I wanted all my utensils to be washed 3 times. So like there were some things that I had that were making me anxious going into this trip. But then we got there, and I got to meet the people, and I got to see how God was moving in their lives. And we're talking about people who are living in like lean-tos. Like, we're talking about people who are living in like a couple sticks they got from the woods, plus some sheet metal that they like tied together with strings and mud and like made it a stable structure, and then the dirt floor. Like, we're getting to meet some of these people, and it's beginning to hit me a little bit, like some of the things that I'm anxious about, like they don't even have the luxury to be anxious about, and my heart began to break, and at that point I began to really feel drawn there. And so for the next few years, we'd go back every single year as a family. I remember I got home from that first trip, and I just like cried. I cried for like 2 weeks every single day. Like, my heart was just completely shattered. And then we went back for several years after that. And then going into my senior year, I really wanted to go and do like full-time missions there. And so I was like, this is something that I'm gonna kind of like set my focus on. And I reached out to the organization down there, and I was like, hey, like, when our team comes down this summer, can I stay for an extra week and just kind of see like what's daily life look like apart from a mission trip? And so they're like, sure, go ahead. So I went down, I stayed for 2 weeks. It was an incredible experience. And towards the end of the experience, we were getting onto onto a boat, and I might have shared this story with you guys before. I'm not sure what I've shared and what I'm not sure. But we were getting onto a boat, and they were taking me to this mountain across the lake. And I realized halfway across the lake, we all realized the person that we were on the boat with was drunk. And he was just like a fisherman that we had like paid to like take us across the lake. And so we didn't really know who this guy was. We realized halfway across that he was just very, very drunk. And then it started to storm really, really hard. And it was like a big tropical storm that just hit right in the middle. And we're on a metal boat in the middle of a lake, in the middle of a thunderstorm with a drunk guy at the wheel, or metaphorical wheel. And we're like, hey, let's go back. And he's like, no, we got to go all the way across. It's probably safer that way. And we're like, we don't know what this guy means by if it's safer to go all the way across or if it's safer to go back. And in that moment, I realized there was kind of a convergence of all the things that I had feared over my life. And then I realized that I wasn't afraid. And we were sitting there in the boat, and I had like an overwhelming sense of just God's goodness and God's mercy and God's presence. And I felt at peace, I felt restful, and I felt joy in the middle of a thunderstorm on the little metal boat in the middle of the lake where I was like thousands of miles from my family and a bunch of uncertainty. And in that moment, that was probably the first time in my life where I had experienced that level of like transformation in my heart from the Lord. And that made me even more feel like, man, I just really want to come here and I really want to do missions here. I want my life to be about like serving these people and loving this community. And so then I graduated high school. I went to Bible college. And the Bible college I was going to had a program where you could do 2 years of Bible college, and then they send you to a country to do missions and finish out 2 years online and work with their missions organization. And they had a missions organization in El Salvador. So I was like, great, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go with this group of people and spend 2 years in El Salvador doing missions, and then maybe if it works out, I'll just stay after that. So then I'm in college, going through these first 2 years, and a couple of things happened. One is that I got engaged to somebody that was not Kirsten. Surprise! Anyways, I was 20, and it was a bad relationship, and I just like jumped in way too fast. And if you know me, I tend to jump into things way too fast, so it wasn't really a surprise. But I got into this really bad relationship with this girl, and she had like hesitantly agreed to like go to El Salvador with me, but she really wasn't about it. And then in that same time, they canceled the El Salvador trip. They were like, it's getting too dangerous down there. We're not going to send college students there anymore. But you can like go to Mexico if you want to. And I was like, I don't have a heart for Mexico. Like I want to go to El Salvador. And then she was like, I really don't have a heart for Mexico. I don't really have a heart for El Salvador either. Like let's just not do anything related to missions. Well, anyways, long story short, clearly that didn't work out with me and her. We ended up breaking up, and I ended up coming back to Ohio, just kind of really sad because I was like, my life had just gone in a completely different direction than I expected it, and I wasn't going to El Salvador. And then I get back, and I was like 20 years old, and I was living with my family in the Lewis Center, and I had got the opportunity to become a youth pastor at a church in Delaware. And so I was like, yeah, let's do it. I'll be a youth pastor at this church for a little while until the Lord opens the door for me to go to El Salvador or some other missions thing. And that's kind of what I was thinking. And in my head, honestly, that was probably just like a short-term solution to a bigger problem. But then I started met Kirsten. A lot of things happened, but ultimately, we started feeling the Lord call us to Delaware and to be in Delaware. And I did not want to be in Delaware because in my head, I was like, Delaware is the opposite of like what I'm aiming at. Like, Delaware is one of the wealthiest counties. The county of Delaware is like one of the wealthiest counties in Ohio. I was like, this is not what I want. And so, but we really felt a strong sense from the Lord that we were supposed to be here. I didn't tell Kirsten that I was wrestling with this. And then one day we get into the car after church while we were engaged, and she goes, hey, by the way, I think the Lord is telling us that we're supposed to move to Delaware. And I was like, yeah, I think so too. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to, but I feel like that's what the Lord is saying as well. So we ended up moving here, and then we ended up beginning to see some of the pain points of the city of Delaware. We began to see some of the more impoverished communities and some of the drug-ridden communities and some of the more difficult situations in the city of Delaware. And we began to see some of the subsidized apartment complexes and the low-income housing, and our hearts began to break, and we're like, we didn't even know this was here. And we didn't even know this was like something that existed in Delaware. And this is a few years into serving in Delaware and living in Delaware. And so, long story short, the opportunity for the Dream Center came up, and that was kind of already where our hearts were moving and turning anyways. And the Lord opened that door, and we capitalized on it. And so, here we are. We've been doing that for about 4 years now. And it has been a crazy 4 years, let me tell you. There have been like some really beautiful, incredible moments, and then there have just been some really difficult, heartbreaking, like earth-shattering moments. And so I'm going to share about all of that with you guys today. But I want to start with just like in this process, I want to share the whole bandwidth of what the experience has been, starting with like what have I not done well. So like when we started with the Dream Center 4 years ago, what did that look like? And the reason for that is because I think there's specifically in the things that I haven't done well, I think there's a temptation for like all of us to not do well. There's just like some consistent grooves of thought. I think within the church at large and maybe within just humanity and how we handle and serve people in these kind of situations. And so the biggest thing really is like, at first, it was really hard for me, and I'm just going to be totally honest and vulnerable with you guys, so you guys do with this what you want. But it was really hard for me to not see people as a part of my job. It was really hard for me to not see people as like something that needed to be fixed or a task that needed to be accomplished, because it was like, this is what I'm doing every single day, and this is what I'm in the thick of, in the midst of every single day. And so I had a really hard time with at the very beginning, and it's still hard sometimes to stay on top of this, but at the very beginning I had a really hard time with letting people fall through the cracks, because I wasn't seeing people as much as individuals, but like as just like a part of what we're doing as a whole, if that makes sense. And in Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11, God speaks to this, and there's a couple things that I just kind of want to pull out of this passage real quick, but it says, if there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him, and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Beware that there is no base in thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of remission, is near, and your eye is hostile towards your brother, and you give him nothing, and then may cry out to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work, in all your undertakings, for the Lord will never cease to be in the land, or for the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land. And this is neat, because God is saying a couple things here. All right, first, he's really speaking to the heart of the person. He's saying, listen, I'm not just asking you to give. I'm not just asking you to serve and to make yourself available, but I'm asking you to do it like from a genuine and authentic place, out of the kindness and the love of your heart for the person that you are serving, for the person that you are giving to, for the person that you are loving or being hospitable towards. And then the second thing, that's a really interesting thing to say, I think, but the more that I was ruminating on this, the more it became clear, is he says that the poor will always be with you. So, what does that mean? And stick with me for a second, because this was kind of a revelation for me, but it means that the goal is not to eradicate poverty. Now, I know that sounds kind of weird coming from somebody whose goal is to lower the poverty level in Delaware and help people who are impoverished. But the goal is not to eradicate poverty. The goal is to love the person in front of you. And that's exactly what this is saying, right? He says that it's to give to the person in front of you. It specifically says to give to one of your brothers in any of your towns and in your land which the Lord has given to you. And so actually, when I asked Jordan when he asked me to do hospitality to the least of these, I was like, what do you mean by hospitality? And he said two things, which I thought were really good. He said proximity and friendship. And so I'm going to use that for this, which is that like the goal is to love the people in need, the people that society deems the least of these, the people who have been outcast, who are within proximity to you, and to have friendship with them. Right? It's to engage them in a meaningful and loving way. And that looks like serving them. That looks like meeting needs. That looks like helping. That looks like contending for their well-being and their benefit. But it's an individual thing. You have to serve the person in front of you. Because here's the problem, is if your goal is to eradicate poverty, then the ends justifies the means. The means justifies the ends. And the end justifies the means. How do you get this was? The end justifies the means. So that means that if you're going to try to eradicate poverty, you'll do whatever it takes to get there. But if you're just trying to love the person in front of you, then you'll do whatever it takes to love that person well. And then to see how that will then begin to transform their lives and help them move into a better situation. And so that's kind of the process of how I began to overcome that first obstacle in front of me, which was like I initially started with a mindset where the ends justified the means. But here's what really shifted for me, and this is why a relationship is so important. I actually began to get to know people and build relationships with people, and then I began to love them, and then I began to actually want what was best for them, and then that kind of shifted and that kind of changed everything, and I began to see the individual. I began to see the trees in the forest. You know what I'm saying? And so that kind of moves into more of like, well, what have I done well? And I just want to share 2 quick stories with you guys about just some really neat things that have happened recently that I feel like have just been success stories, even in the midst of difficulty, even in the midst of hardship. They were success stories. So I got a phone call. Actually, it was a text. I got a text like a month ago from a lady, and it's a mom of some kids that we serve, and she was like, "I don't want you to think that I'm crazy." She said, "But my daughter has been seeing things in the house, like creepy things, and I'm not going to go into detail, but there are creepy things. Seeing creepy things in the house, coming downstairs all throughout, not just the night, but during the day, like just completely terrified, just weeping and like just beside herself. And they were at the point where they were like, we don't know what to do. We don't know how what this means. We don't know how to approach this, and we don't know who to reach out to because like this is weird." And so she's like, "I don't want you to think I'm crazy. I just want to know what we should do." And so I texted her back and I was like, "I don't think you're crazy. I think it could be demonic. Like, let's just bring a team in and maybe we can just pray over your house and see what the Lord does." And so we brought a team, and I brought one of our kids volunteers, and then I brought a friend of mine who I know is like just a really discerning guy, like who would have been really good in that room just to kind of see what was going on in like the spirit. And so we go over to their house. We spent like maybe 20 minutes in prayer and worship. The really cool thing was like the whole family was there. They were participating with us in prayer and worship for like 20 minutes. And then we just asked the Lord, like, "All right, Lord, what do you want to do?" And my one friend, he felt like he got a word for the father, so he began speaking that word over the father, and the father is like in tears, and he's just like hitting something that had been really recently going on in this man's life. And then we just sat down with the kids, and we prayed a prayer of blessing over the kids, and then we went upstairs to the room where it was happening, and we were in the room, and we're just praying over the room and kind of asking the Lord to deliver this house of whatever is going on. And at the end of the conversation, we asked the woman about Jesus. And, it was in our minds, the verse where Jesus says, if you cast out one and you don't fill it with something, then like 7 more come back. And so we were asking her about Jesus, and she's like probably my age, maybe around my age, maybe a little bit older. She was like, I don't have a grid for what you're talking about. I was like, have you ever heard the gospel? She's like, I don't know what the gospel is. I was like, do you know what it means to follow Jesus? She was like, nope. Like, she was just like lost. She had never heard the gospel. She did not know what it meant to follow Jesus. As far as she knew, Jesus was just like a cultural figure that she was like loosely aware of. And so we shared the gospel with her, and she got really excited. We said, is this something that you'd be interested in doing? Would you be interested in following Jesus? And she got really excited. She said, yeah, I would love to do that. And so we got to like lead her to the Lord. But what's really cool about that situation, and why this story really applies to what we're talking about today, is that conversation was 4 years in the making. That conversation did not just happen in one day. For 4 years, every single week, we were sending teams to the apartment complex that she lives in and serving and loving and praying with people, hosting block parties there, picking up kids from there, bringing them back here and doing kids ministry with them, so that when something really weird happened and she didn't know who to text or who to call, she felt comfortable and she trusted us enough to call, right? It was about proximity, it was about relationship, it was about intentionally loving the community, and the Lord opened that door for us. The next story is not as cool as that story, but it's a neat opportunity again of just like the consistency and the friendship and the trust. So there's a family that we are serving right now that had just recently gotten evicted from their household. This is their second time in like the last, I think, 6 months that we've known them. They got evicted. The first time was really heartbreaking because we kind of found out through the grapevine. They didn't tell us, and then one day we get to their house and like all their stuff is just piled up in front of their house, and they're just not there. And like I was like frantically texting, trying to figure out where they were, and like all their stuff is getting thrown away. Like the kids' shoes are getting thrown away. Like it was just a mess. And so then we luckily found them, and we were able to continue serving them. Their kids come here on Saturdays, and we serve them groceries throughout the week. And they've been really active in our block parties, and it's such a family that we really love and got to know really well. And then they kind of settled in, and it felt like they were doing really well. And 2 weeks ago, on a Monday, I get a text, and it's the dad, and he's like, "Hey, we're getting evicted. We have to be out tomorrow. We need to get all of our stuff moved." And now I'm having flashbacks to last time where all their stuff is like in front of their house, and I'm like, we really want to make sure that they don't have that situation happening again. So he had a storage unit, but no way to get the stuff to the storage unit. And I was not able, because he called me the day of, I was not able to go and move his stuff that night. And he was like, if it didn't happen the next day, like the stuff was going to be out in the street. So I called one of our volunteers, and I was like, hey, I can't make it tonight, but like, come to the Dream Center, grab the keys and take the cargo van to pick up this family stuff if you're available. And he was more than willing. He was super honored to be able to do that, actually. So he came, he went, he got their stuff. Not only that, but he, with his own money, went to Walmart with them, got a ton of stuff for them. He called it like a care kit for the week while they were going to be at a hotel that they're staying at while they're kind of figuring out what's next. And just like abundantly blessed them. And then since then, he has consistently just been checking in and abundantly blessing them and taking care of them. And I got a text from the dad a couple days ago, and he said, like, I just want you guys to know, I don't know what we'd do without you. I really appreciate like how much you've given to us. And in this specific situation, it wasn't even a Dream Center thing. It's this one volunteer who's really specifically decided to love and pour into this family. But here's the neat thing about that story, because obviously the eviction is not cool. Like that's really heartbreaking, and we've been navigating that with the kids as they come on Saturdays, and they're kind of trying to figure out how they're processing through that emotionally. But the cool thing is that when they were falling, we were able to be there, right? When there was chaos and upheaval in their lives, it's the consistency, it's the proximity and the friendship that allowed us to be able to be there with them and walk with them through that situation. And that's why hospitality is so important. That's why it's so important to be consistent in these relationships and intentional and engaged, because we were able to be there with them in that time, and that was meaningful to them, that was impactful to them. But it's not always easy. In fact, I would say most of the time it's not easy. And so this is kind of like where it has been hard. There's a few places that like specifically in my life I've experienced it be hard, and in conversation with our volunteers, I think that they would say the same thing, that they've consistently experienced this to be difficult. One is just like genuinely engaging. And I know that sounds weird in light of what I said earlier, but here's the reality. The reality is that when you genuinely engage, it hurts. Like that's just going to happen. When you genuinely engage into broken situations, that means you're giving your heart to those situations. It's not always going to feel good, and you're going to allow yourself to be hurt in the middle of those situations. One thing that I was really not good at the very beginning was processing that. I tried to like just really box it off, like, okay, this is work and like this is home, and so like these hard things happen during the day, but I'm just gonna like let that go and then just like keep moving on with life. And I was not processing with the Lord some of the more difficult situations that were happening with these families that we were engaging with, and that was not good. Like that was having a genuine, authentic, it was having a real impact on my soul. And so learning how to process that with the Lord, learning how to allow Him to transform my heart in the midst of that. So that the hardest thing genuinely has just been like sometimes the sadness, sometimes the frustration, sometimes I feel really angry, sometimes I feel like really angry at situations that are going on in people's lives and the context surrounding it. And then sometimes, to be honest, I feel really angry at people who are putting themselves in the situations, and they have kids that we love And it's like over and over and over and over again. And it's trying to consistently love them well in the midst of that. But the reality is, and you guys have experienced this because this is not just true about this specific topic, it's true about relationships in general. Anytime you give yourself to someone to love them well, anytime you give yourself to someone to desire their well-being, no matter what, you will experience pain. It will be hard, and it will be difficult, but it really has been so worth it. And Isaiah 58, 10 through 11 says this, "And if you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your gloom will become like midday, and the Lord will continually guide you and satisfy your desire in scorched places, and give strength to your bones, and you will be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail." And that has been a super encouraging verse to me because what really stands out to me here is that if you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, if you choose to engage in the difficult situations, if you choose to engage in the hardships of people's lives, then the Lord will continually guide you and satisfy your desire in scorched places and give strength to your bones. And you will be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. And this is what I had to learn really early because I was not doing this well. Is like the Lord has to be the one to minister to my heart and satisfy me and water my dry bones. And that if I let him do that, then I can become like a garden, like a watered garden and a spring of water whose water does not fail. Then I can become like a watered garden in the community. But if I don't do that, then I'm like a dried up garden and I have nothing to give. And I found myself that way at the beginning. Like I would just consistently bump into moments where it was like a hard situation, and I felt like I had to respond, but I had nothing to give. And so, really prioritizing, letting the Lord minister to our hearts and receiving all that He wants to give to us, like walking in consistent and faithful communion with Him, and allowing Him to touch those broken and those painful parts when we experience those difficult moments. It opens the door for greater engagement in the future and the opportunity to continue to be the light in the darkness. And this is something that Jesus not only modeled, but He asked us to model. He asked us to serve people who society considers the least of these. He asked us to serve and care for and love people well who society casts out and marginalizes. Matthew 25, 31 through 40 says this, "When the Son of Man comes into His glory and all the angels with Him, He will sit on His glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before Him, and He will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And He will put the sheep on His right and the goats on His left. Then the King will say to those on His right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer Him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' Then the King will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least one of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" Jesus decided to use hospitality to the least of these as a marker of His true followers. Now, I'll explain that in a second, but I want to say it one more time, and I just want the tension of that to settle in, because I'm not just saying that because that's something that I specifically feel called to, but if you read Matthew 25, this is what He's saying, is that Jesus decided to use hospitality to the least of these as a marker of His true followers. That's not a behavioral thing, right? That's a heart thing. It's saying, listen, if you have decided to give your life to following Jesus, then you've given your life to letting your heart be transformed by Him, into His heart. That you become more and more like Him. That you begin to see people in front of you the way that He sees people in front of you. And what that means is, it means seeing Him in the people in front of you, because He says, "Whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done to me." Mother Teresa has a quote that I really like. And I've wrestled with too a ton over the last 6 months. She says, "I see Jesus in every human being. I say to myself, this is hungry Jesus, I must feed him. This is sick Jesus. This one has leprosy or gangrene, I don't know. I must wash him and tend to him. I serve because I love Jesus. And the reality is that he's flipping the narrative, right? So he's saying, the reason he's calling these people the least of these is because this is what society deems the least of these. But remember, a few chapters before that, he said the last shall become first, and the first shall become last. And so he's saying that we should be able to see the face of the Messiah, the King of the world, in the lowliest person, and that he actually identified himself. This is really important to know. Jesus identified himself with the least of these. In that verse, that's what he's specifically doing. He says, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. So he is specifically identifying himself with the lowest people in society when he says that, in terms of like how that would have come across in that cultural moment. Where the guy who they're saying, this is the King of the world, like this is the Messiah, the anointed one that we've been waiting for, the one that they had anticipated would come and overthrow Rome and be this like victorious warrior. And instead of that, he says, I'm going to identify myself with what you consider to be the least of these, with what you consider to be the lowest people in society. And he just like smacked him in the face and just flipped the narrative upside down. And that's what and so the reason then I say that Jesus decided to use hospitality to the least of these as a marker of his true followers is because that's what was important to him. That's what he engaged in. That's who he served. Jesus consistently touched people who were ceremonially unclean in the Jewish law. And that should have made him unclean according to ceremony. But actually what happened was when he touched them, he made them clean. Right? And so Jesus consistently engaged with people who society would say are the outcast, the marginalized, the least of these, the people not worth engaging with. We choose to look at people's faces and see what is good and beautiful about them and who they truly are in spite of what others say and in spite of what our initial perspective might be. This is important too. Sometimes we butt up against our initial perspective because we're raised in a specific cultural context. But we have to be able to look at people and see the good and beautiful in them, which is Jesus, and to see what is true about them, who God made them to be, in spite of what society says about them, and in spite of how we even naturally feel when we first meet them. And that if we choose to do that, we'll actually find the image of God in them, we'll find Jesus in them, and we'll find a genuine love for them. When Jesus says that when we love people, we're serving him, it's not an excuse, or when we're serving people, we're serving him, it's not an excuse to do that as like a task and say, well, I'm serving you because it's serving Jesus. To authentically serve Jesus in the midst of serving the least of these is to authentically serve the person in front of you with the heart of Jesus. Does that make sense? It's different than just saying, I'm going to go do this because Jesus said to, and it's like, that's serving Jesus, check. It's like, no, to serve Jesus in the midst of serving the least of these is to genuinely and authentically serve the person in front of you. When we do that, Jesus meets us there, and he meets us and them. So when we commit to doing that, not only does Jesus meet us there in that moment, for us becomes an encounter with Jesus, it becomes an encounter with Jesus for them too, and then both people are transformed. By the way, this is just the last thing that I want to note, and then we'll move into some of the more practical stuff, but the least of these doesn't just mean the poor. The least of these doesn't just mean the sick or the broken. Jesus did this really well with somebody who society would have deemed the least of these, who was probably wealthy, which was Matthew, right? Matthew was a tax collector. Matthew would have had tons of money. But Matthew was considered the least of these in the Jewish society because he was cheating and robbing people. And not only that, but he was betraying the Jewish people by aligning himself with the Roman government. So society would have considered Matthew the least of these. And what did Jesus do? He looked at Matthew and he saw the good and the beautiful in him. He looked at Matthew and he saw what God had intended for Matthew's life, and he began to speak to that. He began to engage with that instead of engaging with what society said Matthew was. And that's how we should interact with all people. So here's a couple practical steps, just as you go through the weeks about what how can you engage in this. When you are with someone, try to be as present with them as you can possibly be. And at the same time, keep the presence of God in mind while you were doing that. So when you're with someone, try and be as present to that moment as you can possibly be. Like, try to the best of your ability to still your mind and not let it be wandering in 1,000 other directions. That of all the thoughts and swirls and thoughts swirling around your head in the to-do list, and try to just like be as present to that person as you can possibly be. And while you're doing that, try and let your mind also be as aware of the presence of God in that moment as you possibly can. And then you can also ask the Lord, who are the least of these in your everyday life, and then intentionally begin moving towards them. Who are the people that you regularly cross paths with that society would deem the least of these, or that people will just have a hard time interacting with or engaging with, or make people feel uncomfortable? And how can you begin to intentionally move towards them and engage as the presence of God in their lives? And then this is the last thing. Remember that your job is not to fix people. That will crush you. If you try to make it your job to fix people, that will crush you. Your job is not to fix people. It's to be a conduit of the presence of God and the love of God in their lives. So your job is just to be a conduit of the love of God and the presence of God in their lives. And as you do that, people will become transformed and you will become transformed. But if you go in thinking, I'm just going to fix this person, it's going to, first of all, it's going to come across really bad. It's going to probably hurt them. And what you're doing is you're putting like an immense weight on your shoulders to do something that you're not being called to do. You're just being called to love the person in front of you and to be a conduit of the presence of God in their lives. So, we're going to move into response time. And here's what I want to do while we do response time. I think the key thing here, one of the biggest things, and one of the biggest lessons that I've learned over the last few years, and just trying to practice, like, what does hospitality to the least of these look like, is what Mother Teresa said and what Matthew 25 talks about, which is like, what does it look like to really look into someone's face and see the image of God, and then what does it look like to look into someone's face and see Jesus present there. And that can be a hard thing. It can be a hard thing when, like, someone is consistently disappointing you, or when you are looking into someone's face who you know, like, man, I really want what's best for you, and you're refusing to change in this moment. It can also be a hard thing when it's like someone that is in a really, really difficult situation, and you don't know if you're going to have the means to really help. But what I've noticed is that the more I learn to fix my eyes on Jesus, the more I learn to turn my attention to Jesus and just have the gaze of my soul on Jesus, the more I'm able to recognize him in other people. And then if I consistently keep my eyes fixed on Jesus, then my attention is already there, then as I'm interacting with other people, I'm able to interact with Jesus in them. And so we're going to play the song, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And while we're doing that, just ask him to help you keep the gaze of your soul fixed on his face throughout this next week. Because it's easier to see Jesus in other people when you're already looking at him. So just as we're responding to this song, and as we're fixing our eyes upon Jesus, just ask him to help you keep your gaze fixed upon this next week. And that as you keep your gaze fixed, when you look at other people, you're not averting your gaze, you're continuing your gaze on Jesus as you see his presence in them. Does that make sense? Cool, let's do that.